Hello and welcome to another episode of EPMS Tech Talk. I'm Joanne LaFlamme.
And I'm Craig Andersen.
So Craig, I thought today we could talk about requirements, system requirements. We get a lot of our new customers as well as existing customers who are upgrading who ask us questions about the requirements for the SQL Server, the client server, the soft SQL versions. I thought that we could talk.
That's a very good topic. And the challenge with this is technology is always changing.
Right.
So this video that we're going to do may be irrelevant in another year or two. But I want to premise by first saying we're not certified IT specialists. So we're going to be doing this video and talk about different things based on our experience, based on what we've seen as best practices in implementing our system. And also I want to note that some of the products that we're going to talk about, like SQL, are actually owned and developed and support by their parent company, like Microsoft.
Okay.
All right, so I just wanted to get that kind of on the table. So there are things that we cover. Most of what we're going to be talking about today are not covered directly by us, like the hardware and some of the software applications.
Okay, great.
All right.
Well, maybe we can start with the SQL Server first and talk about the different ways you could set up, different methods you could use to set up a SQL Server.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So we have a PowerPoint, so we can kind of go through this a little bit. So there are two common approaches to setting up servers these days. The more common one and the newest one is virtual servers. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
So virtual servers are basically images, if you will, of different server operating systems that are encapsulated into an application sort of format that are placed on a physical piece of hardware. The thing to keep in mind with virtualization, there's some pros and cons, mostly pros, I think. But the cons, I want to talk about the cons first. The cons are really, because it's new technology, there's a lot of IT people that don't really have a lot of experience with it.
Right.
So there is a learning curve. I'm not sure if there's really any other con other than that. The pros to it are ease of implementation, minimizing your physical space requirements for servers. For example, we just virtualized not too long ago here. Before, we used to have 9 servers, all tower servers, all individual pieces of hardware that consumed up a whole room, consumed a lot of electricity, consumed and generated a lot of heat. It used to get 90-some degrees in that room on a regular basis, especially during the summer. It was tough keeping the room cool. We invested with Dell into a Vertex system, which is designed specifically for virtualization. It is a Dell product, and it, like I said, it's designed for virtualization, so it has built into the hardware components of the system. It has a special backplane built into it that help with redundancy and emergency backups and so forth. I'm not the best one to fully explain all of it, but I'll touch base on it a little bit. But since we virtualized, we now have one server case that's about 2.5 feet wide, 4 feet tall, in that room with this virtual server that is now housing, I think we have 12 to 14 different servers, including test servers, all in a virtual environment.
Great. Okay.
But it does take some IT knowledge. It took us some experience. We actually contracted an outside vendor that was recommended through Dell for us, and they came in and did it, and that was all part of the investment that we paid for. And I'll tell you, they did a great job. They got it up and running. But what virtualization does is it takes a physical piece of hardware and it allows you to create different servers that can actually run different operating systems. And they're all isolated from each other physically as a server, even though they're physically on the same piece of hardware, but they run independently of each other. And therefore, you have a level of protection because of that, and also the performance can be controlled a little bit.
Okay.
The key with virtualization is you have to have hardware that's really designed for it, especially if you're going to be doing multiple VMs, virtualization servers. Okay.
Okay.
The other method is probably the more common, older method, if you will, and that's just having a physical hardware. Where you would buy or implement a single piece of hardware and run the operating system directly on the hardware that would then run the applications or the database that you want to run on the server. The advantage to that is it's more common practice. More people are familiar with it. It's
Right.
easier to implement. The downside to it is it can be more costly in the long run because now that everything's on this one server, when you're talking about system or business critical servers like the enterprise application, that's a business critical application. You really don't want it on a piece of hardware or a server that has a bunch of other applications on it that could interfere with its operation.
Right.
All right. When you use virtualization, that's where it comes in handy because you can have all these different applications running on their own server environments.
Right.
So they're not contaminating, if you will, the other servers. Back to the hardware part, in today's industry in years past, that was the norm. So you would have to decide and evaluate the cost of that. You would have to evaluate your access to the technology and the experience to implement virtualization as opposed to a piece of hardware.
Okay.
One of the downsides of hardware too is if you do have an OS issue, let's say you had the server running upgrades automatically, and this has happened to us. The upgrade runs, and all of a sudden something on the server is not working because there's a problem with the Microsoft upgrade. When you virtualize, you have a little more protection against that, whereas in the physical hardware, you have a problem in it, and really the only way to avoid that is to go back and retract that upgrade, go
Right.
back to a previous version. With the virtualization, if you're implementing safety and redundancy protocols and backup protocols, you could actually have physical copies of that server, and you can just recopy in or point to the new copy of the server and be up and running from where it ended.
Makes sense.
All right, so there's,
Okay.
and again, I may not be explaining it in the best technical sense, but that's the general concept.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Well, now let's talk a little bit about the requirements on the server for the SQL database.
Okay. So again, looking at the PowerPoint here, we recommend these days that you go with Windows Server 2012 at a minimum. And again, Microsoft comes out with new versions every few years on that.
Okay.
SQL Server, which is the database engine, if you will, we recommend 2012 as well. Standard licensing provided comes with SQL. So you're gonna, buy the required licensing that SQL requires for logins and everything. Enterprise 32 uses a single SQL-based account for a connection. One thing to note, though, with SQL Server 2014, I think it is, it is dependent, the licensing is dependent on the cores. So these days you can buy servers with multiple cores, and 2014 likes to use as many of those cores. So you have to have the appropriate amount of license to deal with that.
Okay.
Whereas I believe if you're on 2012, it's not core dependent, and you don't have to take that into concern, and it doesn't
Okay.
require that extra licensing.
Okay.
Okay. So the next part of it is the CPU socket. So having at least one CPU socket is recommended. 24 gigs of RAM is a minimum. My philosophy on this, and I think any computer geek would agree, the more memory, the better. You have to think about growth. Again, one of the disadvantages to a hardware piece is you have wear and tear on the components, and that machine over time, say about 5-year cycle, they can start to become obsolete.
Okay.
With virtualization, you have a little more flexibility because in theory, you could copy over the virtual server onto a new piece of hardware that you just purchased because the hardware that it's running on has become somewhat obsolete or has a problem with it. Okay?
Okay.
But when buying these servers, again, you want to have some sort of plan in place, whether it's a budgetary plan or a replacement plan. These do have an end of life.
Right.
Now, we've had servers that we've gotten 10 years out of. You know what I mean? But the dust coming out of them at the end of the 10 years was pretty incredible. So it's always best to have a plan in place that in 5 years is probably a good number to at least start looking at the issue, assuming you've had no problems up until then. But at 5 years, you should start evaluating the physical hardware that you have. So if you're running a physical server and no virtualization, you want to just keep an eye on that. Because again, technology is changing.
Right.
And processes are getting stronger and faster, and the more memory capabilities and so forth. And if you're doing virtualization, you still do have hardware, even though the virtualization gives you a little more flexibility. You still have to look at that hardware.
Right.
Okay.
Now, what if you purchase the web modules? You'll have to have a web server. What are the requirements for that? Are they different?
They're pretty much the same as the database server minus the requirement for SQL.
Okay.
The only other difference is you have to have IIS. And
Okay.
I believe if we look at our PowerPoint, IIS 7 is the recommended version these days.
Okay.
Okay, and again, that's going to change down the road.
Right.
One note talking about virtual servers compared to hardware-based servers. We already talked about the database server, now we just talked about the web server. So technically you should have 2 servers now.
Right.
One database server, because it's not a good practice to expose your database server to the outside world.
Right.
At least I don't believe it is. And you want to have a web server that is opened up to the outside world so the web components and the web applications will run. When you're virtualizing, you're still down to only physically one piece
Right.
of hardware. Now you can build a server just for the web and one for your database in a virtual environment.
And they're protected from each other.
And they're
so-
protected from each other, yeah.
Okay.
So there's another good advantage.
All right. The next thing we could talk about are solutions for storage.
Yeah, this is another area in the computer world that changes drastically. And in the last, few years, what's come into play is SSD hard drives, which are different than the hard drives that most of us have been familiar with in the past. The older hard drives are mechanical based, they have working parts in them, the
Yeah.
disk is spinning and everything else. So they can be temperamental and they can wear out over time. The nice thing these days over the SSD drives, those are actually solid state drives that have no working parts, and as time goes on, the capacity of those SSD drives is getting very large. When they first came out, just like memory, the amount of information or size capability was minimal. As time goes on, those capabilities get expanded. So these days, we would recommend SSD drives.
Okay.
They're stabler. They are less subjected to wear and tear or no wear and tear. And I think overall they perform better, they're faster, and that's probably going to improve over time as well. They also have, if you look at the PowerPoint, SSD drives also have the best disaster recovery capability because they're not subjected to mechanical failure. You do have an easier time to get access to the information that may be stored on that, even though your server has failed. Okay. And the price is getting better
Right.
with them.
Okay.
Okay. So the next subject is RAID arrays. Again, I'm not an IT specialist, so I'm not going to really talk about. I can't talk about that exactly. But our recommendation, looking at the PowerPoint, is 10K RAID arrays, which is sufficient. Basically, if I understand the concept properly, the RAID arrays allow multiple drives to manage the information kind of balanced and equally. So it disperses the data storage over a wider gamut or plane, that helps minimize the problems that you can have from disaster. Because the data is dispersed over it, you have a better and stronger chance of recovering all that data.
Okay.
But also performance-wise, they can perform a lot better.
Okay.
All right.
Well, our next topic would be backup, which we all know is extremely important.
Oh yeah. And I giggle because, and it's not funny actually, but it's amazing how many times we've heard or customers have had disasters, whether they're hardware crashes or whatever, server crashes, and they don't have backups.
Yep.
And that's why I chuckle, because this is a very important conversation. I can't stress enough how important it is that you have some sort of backup protocol and procedure in place in your organization. You're talking about an application that is running your business. You depend on this application on a daily basis to manage everything about your business. You don't want to lose that information.
Right.
And you need, when you invest in a network and into the hardware, whether it be virtualization or whatever, you want to make sure that part of that investment is for disaster recovery.
Right.
And doing backups is the number one component to that. Because if all else fails, if you have a good backup, the world's not over.
Right.
You can recover it. Again, being virtualized, that recovery can be quicker and easier.
Right.
Being all hardware based, it still can be done, but there's more, more physical work that has to be put into getting a new server up and running.
Right.
Okay, so backups. There's many ways to do it.
Okay.
I don't know if you still see a lot of it. We used to do it, tape backups,
Right.
or some sort of physical media resource backup, where your server is backing up to a media device, tape, whatever it may be. And then that tape should be, because this is only going to work 100% if that tape or physical media is actually removed from site.
Right. In case you have a fire or a
Yeah,
flood
because
or
if you have a
something. Yeah.
backup and you're only backing it up to just another server or another data storage area, and then God forbid there's a crisis. People in New Jersey suffered a really bad hurricane disaster that some of our customers were affected by, and you'll lose that information even though you were doing backups.
Right.
I think in support can, a lot of these questions that I'm not clarifying, our support team can clarify these for you, but I think a good protocol is to have SQL create a backup that's being stored in a directory on your network or on the server, but then that whole directory and that whole server is being backed up to a backup resource. Okay. So physical media is one way of doing that. And there are many software applications out there that allow you to configure this. Sometimes you can buy these with your server. I can't even list all of them. The ones we used to use were Dell ones. We actually got away from the tape server because there is a slight pain in the neck or challenge with it. If I wasn't here, and I was the one that normally took the tape home every night or brought it back in and I was on vacation, then I needed to find somebody else responsible to do that and make sure that it got done every night, change out the tapes and take the tapes home. So there is some work to it, but again, it is a backup, so it's great to have at a minimum. The next step up is investing in some of these new disaster recovery appliances. All the major computer systems have them. We're actually going to be talking to Dell, looking into some different disaster recovery things. I don't know the specific names, but they have appliances and components that you can implement within your organization that backups can be pushed to, and then those can be actually pushed out of the office as well. Okay. So that's another thing to look at. And then what we are doing today, and it seems to work pretty well, we haven't had any problems that we know of. We work with Rackspace, which is a big global company. We use them for cloud data storage, where all of our employees have their own cloud-based drive, and then we also have company-based drives that have all the commonly shared and used documents. So no matter where we are in the office, outside the office, we can access those documents through the cloud service. But we also subscribe to their cloud backup. So every one of our servers, including our workstations, you install an application on it, and a drive gets created in the cloud on one of their servers that is the backup depository, if you will. And that application that you've installed on the server, then that's where you create the schedule of when it backs up and actually dictate what directories it backs up. So you don't have to necessarily back up the whole server, because that's a lot of information, but there are directories on your server that you want to back up I don't think you need to back up the OS, right? You can easily recover the OS, but there's directories that have files, documents, or in the case of enterprise, the directory that has a database or the copy of the database. Okay, so we use that, and that works pretty good. I get a report sent to me every day, which servers backed up with no problems and which one had errors, and we can drill down and investigate the errors. And a lot of times, every once in a while, one server will back up, 6 times out of 7 days. One day it will fail on a backup because there was a process running on the server that kept it from completing the backup or initiating the backup.
Okay.
That's not a huge concern because it does back up the next night. If I see getting that report, if I see that trend more than one day, then we dig deeper into the problem and see if there's something we need to fix.
Okay.
Okay, so cloud-based backup is probably the best, and the PowerPoint shows cloud-based backup as the primary option and hardware-based as the second. And again, I can't stress enough how important it is. I don't care what it is, that you have some sort of backup.
Another point we should make too is that they should make sure the backups are good. So we've had that, seen that case in support where they think they're backing it up, but it turns out they weren't right and they weren't good.
Yeah, that's happened a couple of times. Yeah, so that's a whole part of the whole procedure thing. You decide what backup method works best for your organization.
Right.
That one that's going to be done on a scheduled basis. The least human interaction involved, the better. But you also, part of that, you need to check those backups and verify that they're actually backing up properly.
Right.
Because you don't want to run under the false premise that things are being backed up, and then God forbid you have a disaster, and now you need to depend on that backup, and only to find out it's corrupted or incomplete.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So I think there's a lot of other things that we need to talk about, the client operating systems. So we'll jump into that. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint, and we'll go from there. When we are talking about the Enterprise 32 application itself,
Right.
which talks to the database server, which we just covered. There's a couple of ways that you can actually access and deploy, if you will, the Enterprise 32 client, which allows the access to the database. So the first one, if you look at this PowerPoint, is a local workstation install. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
So basically, this is when you actually or physically install the application on a workstation for every user.
Okay.
All right, so the application is installed locally, and it is connecting to the database and talking to the database through a standard network connection. All right, and when you do this, there's some pros to this. It's the most cost-effective way to do it, but it adds a little more workload when you want to upgrade, because if you have 20 clients with the application installed, then you need to install the upgrade on 20 clients.
Right.
All right. So if you look at this PowerPoint, the next subject is terminal service install. And there's some specific details we'll go through, but let's talk in general. So terminal services is where you would have a physical, usually the protocol is to have an application server in place. So a lot of the server specs themselves would follow the same server specs that you had for the database minus SQL, obviously. But you would have this application server where you would have all the required licensing and everything for terminal services, and each one of your users will then access and run the application through this application server. So when they're on their workstation is running all sorts of different programs, but when they run Enterprise, they're actually launching a remote connection to the application server, which in turn is talking to the database.
Okay.
Okay. There's some advantages to that because unlike the local install, you're only installing the application in one centralized location and everybody's accessing that single single point, if you will. And when people are using the application, they're actually running an image of that application on their workstation. Right? So it's very easy for deployment. However, there is a added cost because with terminal services, you need to have the appropriate licensing. And if you have, I believe, if we look at the PowerPoint, it says Server 2016, you actually are required to have core licensing too to operate the application server with terminal services. Some people I've seen run their remote connections on the same server they're running the database. All right. So if you're using virtualization, instead of physically having another application server, you can still have one physical box.
Right.
One virtual machine or server is run the database, and then you create another virtual machine to be your application server.
Right.
So that's actually a good way to handle it. So you're not physically adding another server, you just physically add in a virtual server. But you're still required to meet these licenses. So let's look at this. So for terminal services installed, you need to have 1 cal per Windows user remote into the application server. So what that means is each user that is accessing the application via the application server is required to have a terminal service license.
Right.
Okay. So the next one I touch base roughly is if you're running Server 2016, there is some core licensing required, 1 license for each CPU core to utilize the application server, which basically means the same thing we sort of discussed earlier with the cores on the database server. You have to have licensing for each of the cores.
Okay.
However, if you're using a lesser version like Server 2012, then you eliminate that core licensing need. Okay.
And I know we have some customers that actually have a mixed environment where they have some local workstations and also a terminal server, so that's an option too.
Yeah, that's a very good option. The benefit to that is you can keep some of your costs down. You can also gain that flexibility from a remote terminal service connection because in theory, you can access the application from outside your office.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So that's a nice advantage of terminal services. So the advantage of terminal services is one centralized depot that is running the application where everybody is connecting to, and the flexibility when you have remote offices, remote locations, or if you're foolish enough to be on vacation and need to check in at work, you can do it through terminal services.
Right.
The downside to it is an added cost.
Right.
And a knowledge. Because again, to implement terminal services, your IT person has to have the knowledge of properly implementing it because you're going to run into network configuration things that are required, printer. If when you're working at a local workstation and you're running terminal services, the application's actually on the application server. Now I want to print something to the printer that's right behind me. So that server has to be set up with all the print drivers for every printer that you're going to be printing the application through.
Right.
Or printing for the application, okay? So that kind of covers the basic stall of how you can deploy enterprise. So you can either locally install it or run it remotely.
Okay.
So the workstations themselves, these days, you need to have Windows 7, 8, or 10.
Okay.
I've had questions recently about people asking about 10. Have we had any problems? We use it internally here on probably 20% of our machines, and nobody's really experienced any problems with it.
Okay.
The one thing I can say, because we are a Microsoft development house, there are usually no issues going forward. It's going back in older versions like XP. You can't run a lot of our new modules in XP because they're designed and developed in the new Microsoft development platform, which isn't cohesive with XP, the older technology.
Right.
Okay. So as Microsoft continues to evolve with their operating systems and their development tools, we have to continue to evolve. And as our application, as you know, is going through an evolution from the old code set to the new code set, as we complete and make that change, you're going to be required to get up to those newer workstations.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I have seen people, and you can get away with this because we haven't touched data collection. And I think you being more experienced and working with clients with this, I believe data collection, for the most part right now, you can still get away with running it on some of the older operating systems, but that will eventually come to an end. Is that true?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, okay. So, so that's one thing that, because I know what companies do, they take their older machines and they push them out
Right.
onto the shop floor. But actually, I want to talk about that for a minute because while we're on the data collection subject, I think a good way of handling data collection is instead of investing in a new PC out there, unless there's another reason that that person or group or department needs a PC, you can use something like a Surface, a Windows Pro Surface Pro, which is very good. You can actually run a whole application on it, but it's definitely very good when you're just running data collection. And it's a lot more portable, and
Right.
you're connecting via Wi-Fi and everything, which we'll touch base a little bit more on Wi-Fi when we get further on. But so that's a good thing to do with data collection. So workstations, for some of the other minimums, you want a dual core CPU, a minimum of 2 gigs of RAM, but just like I said with the server, more RAM the better. And now we get to some of the network issues. All right, so our program, being a critical business application, also depends on a very healthy
Right.
network. If you're having bandwidth issues, especially if you're remoting in using terminal services, or pushing over different departments that may not be in the same physical building, your bandwidth or your network workload can have a big effect on enterprise. We're constantly trying to make changes to enterprise to improve its speed where we are told there are speed issues. You know, occasionally we've been told by customers that some reports take a little long to run, so we've done things to optimize that once we're made aware of it. But it's important that your network that you're using is good and healthy to push it. And enterprise relies on, if you look at the PowerPoint slide here, relies on the standard TCP/IP protocol, okay, when connecting on the network. And as it says on the screen here, poor network health can affect the service, the performance of the operating system, not the operating system, I'm sorry, of enterprise. And one of the areas that you do suffer these network issues is with your router, router and switches. So you want to make sure you got the up-to-date router and switches that are running to 10, 100 to 1,000, bandwidth. And that'll just help everything. And then there's other things in the network you have to look at, how your domain's constructed and everything else. But that's where an IT specialist comes in. On the slide, it says no Wi-Fi based solutions recommended. So what that really means, I did just mention Wi-Fi for data collection.
Right.
Well, here's the thing. Data collection is not one of those heavily burdened modules that is doing a lot of calculations or is trying to pull a lot of information out of the database. The amount of information that's being transmitted back and forth from data collection is minimal.
Right.
So you can get away with, Wi-Fi connections for data collections, assuming you got good Wi-Fi. I mean, if you have a Wi-Fi, router up in the front office and the signal in the back of the plant is weak, then obviously you're going to have performance issues.
Right.
So assuming that the Wi-Fi signal is strong and you're using a modern day Wi-Fi wireless router or whatever it is, you should get good performance in the data collection sort of module.
Okay.
Shipping module even. But it will not work very well with like estimated order entry, scheduling, I'd say probably even CRM, and I wouldn't trust it with your accounting modules.
Right, yep.
Okay? Because having a good, dependable, strong network connection with accounting is critical when you're trying to process batches and so forth. Okay? So let's talk about the shared folder. So when you install Enterprise, you have a couple options when it comes to how you handle reports and also the files and images, as you can see from this slide. So let's talk about reports. So you can install, if you're doing a local client install, you have the option of installing the reports locally, which is the second stage to every install that we give you.
Right.
So you have the core application install, which upgrades the core application. And then you'll get a custom executable that installs any custom reports we've done for you, which overwrites the standard reports that were just implemented with the upgrade.
Right.
Okay? So you can install them locally. The side effect or the negative side effect of that is you still have to do that on every machine.
Right.
Or you can set up a centralized directory on your network server, and you can point each workstation. We're still talking about client install now. You can point each workstation to that centralized report depot. So you only have to upgrade the reports in one location.
Right.
So again, that saves you a lot of time and effort, and it helps manage the reports. That way you're assured that everybody that is using Enterprise is using exactly the same reports, because let's just say I could have upgraded my machine and I upgraded your machine, but then I forgot to upgrade your reports, and I'm running new reports, you're running old reports, so it can cause some issues.
Right.
Okay. So you want to decide, and we recommend, I think these days we probably 90% of the time, if not more than that, always do a centralized report location.
That's true. Yeah, we do.
Okay. The other one is attaching files and images. The system has the ability to either house all the files attached and images attached directly in the database. There's some minor advantages to that, and it's basically the files are secured in that database depot and they can be accessed maybe a little bit quicker. However, the downside to that is, especially with images, your database can grow very large very quickly.
Right.
So we always recommend, as an alternative to that, you set up a location where you can point the application to where it stores all the files and images. I don't know if you have anything in your experience to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is important that you have a central location to put them in, and as long as everybody has access to that location, they'll be able to view the files. The problem's going to be if they try to attach a file from a local PC, like your local C drive, and then you go to another workstation and it's going to look for that file on their C drive and it's not going to be there. So it's really important. You have to, if you're going to not attach them to the database, you really have to have them in a central shared folder.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that everybody has access rights to that.
Correct.
And the word share
Shared.
is the critical point
Right.
there.
In the
Shared
same
folder.
manner,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, okay. So we talked about storing it in the database, and we talked about storing in a shared directory. So the next subject is Outlook, which is used in a couple of ways with our system. Anytime you bring a report, you click a report button to load a report, it brings up a Crystal Report Viewer window, which loads the report. And from there, you do have the ability to email out that particular report, and basically it looks at your default email client, I believe using Mappy, and it so in this case, if you have Outlook, it will load and launch an Outlook window and attach that report as an attachment. The key is, though, one, you have to be using these days Outlook 2007.
Or higher. Right?
Or higher, yeah. And you have to make sure that your Mappy configuration, I guess, is correct. Sometimes I think that can get out of whack or something, but support can help with that. The other area that Outlook is used is if you own our CRM system. CRM does have its own built-in email client, which is the method I prefer for a lot of different reasons, but some people still want to involve Outlook in handling the emails. And when they go to make that decision, they're going to have to understand the pros and cons of each. But that also requires Outlook 2007 or higher to work. Okay. So the other application, and again, like I mentioned in the very beginning of this video, these are applications that are developed by somebody else and supported by somebody else. We are just utilizing them as added tools in our system.
Okay.
And one of those big tools that we use is Crystal. Every report in our system is developed using the Crystal application. And you have to use these days Crystal 2008.
Or higher.
Or higher. Thank you. And That's only if you're going to be modifying your own reports. Okay,
Right.
so let's talk about that a little bit. I think it's a good opportunity. When you buy our system, it comes with a suite of reports. There is usually a minimum of a dozen reports that customers like to change during the implementation process. And some of those basic changes are just reformatting the look and feel, adding some columns, removing some columns, displaying different information up in the header, adding a logo like on the invoice, which you can actually do by placing an image in the database these days. Now, when you contract us to do a report, there's some big advantages to that. And I want to make sure everybody understands this because obviously cost is always an issue for somebody.
Right.
But most of the reports that we do average in cost from a couple $100 on up to maybe $600. I think if you look at all the report writing we do, they all fall within that range and usually somewhere in the middle. The advantage to having us develop them, not only do we develop them and we know our system better, we know our database better, and so as long as we're getting a clear spec from the customer, we can get you the report in, as quick as possible and with minimal back and forth. But we also hold and maintain that report in a special directory for every client that we have. We call it their customs folder. And we take the responsibility for that report for life. And we're not doing that through an added support charge. That's kind of covered under your blanket support. You're just paying the initial one-time cost to develop the report. And as long as you never make any changes or need us to make any changes to that report, it doesn't cost you anything more.
Right.
We maintain it, I don't care if it's 20, 30 years, we'll maintain that report for you. Some customers like to develop or want to develop their own reports because they know Crystal. The problem usually comes that they don't know our database.
Right.
And so there's usually some challenges, and we can help with that through some paid WebEx training.
Right.
We can walk their report writer through the process and show them how to write the report and accomplish what they want. So you get two things done. You get the report finished and the report writer learns something.
Okay.
But the report writer does have to have a very good understanding of Crystal and SQL to even be able to do that.
Right.
The other downside to writing your own reports is you're responsible for that support. So even if you take one of our reports and you just move a column, change a column, under our support agreement, you now own the responsibility of that report. So if something goes wrong with it or you upgrade, you're responsible for now transferring that report into a safer location, then you do the upgrade and then you copy it back in. Or you always keep a copy in a safe location. Either way, you're responsible for doing that. You're responsible to make sure it works with every version that you upgrade. So there's an added level of responsibility. So you may think you're saving some money up front, but the problem really ultimately ends up is a lot of times people don't know our database that well, and they struggle with making the report. So something that would take us a few hours to do once it's being worked on may take them 6 hours.
Yep.
So you have to look at that cost, but then you also have to look at the cost of supporting it. And what happens if that person leaves?
Yep. Yeah.
Now you don't have that person to manage that report anymore.
Right.
We have taken reports back from customers that they have done, and we charge for that. There's kind of like a acquisition fee, if you will, because we have to go through each of those reports and test them and make sure they're working. And there, in some cases, we found that they were written in such a what we consider an improper way. We've actually had to rewrite them to take ownership of them. So it's just something to be aware of.
Right.
You have to kind of outweigh ultimately what the cost is in this whole process.
Right.
Okay. So what else have we got? That's it, I guess, huh? So
Okay.
we've talked about a lot. We've talked about database servers
Right.
and the requirements. We've talked about web servers and the requirements if you're using any of our web applications. We've talked about virtualization as opposed to a fixed piece of hardware that is acting as a server. And then we talked about backups. And again, I want to hit that comment again, that is probably the most critical thing that you need to be exercising in your company is a good proper backup and good backup procedures. And then we just talked about deploying the client through either a local install, which is installing the application on every machine,
Right.
or terminal services where you're remote into an application server, or a mix,
Right.
which you mentioned. So that helps give a balance for different reasons. And then we talked about the applications that are kind of tied to the use of our program, like Crystal and Outlook. So did we miss anything?
I think we covered everything.
All right.
Hopefully our users will find it helpful.
All right.
Well, thank you.
All right.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of EPMS Tech Talk. I'm Joanne LaFlamme.
And I'm Craig Andersen.
Please look forward for more to come.